Hey everyone, I'm going to do something a little bit different today, and that is introduce a theory video for the first time. And I thought a decent place to start would be in answering a question I had gotten previously about limit hold'em small blind play. So we're going to be looking at both some different software today to answer this question, as well as more of a theory related video instead of looking at a hand example, right? So here is MonkerSolver. MonkerSolver, the difference between MonkerSolver and PioSolver is that Monker can handle multi-way solutions, and this is how I have preflop ranges for limit hold'em games. And as you can see on the screen, if you orient yourself to it a little bit, I have two sims up side by side. This one here was made a while back, and it's a three-handed game, and I'm only focusing now on the small blinds play. So we have button raises, and we're going to look at the small blinds play here. First thing I want to call your attention to is the EV of the entire game, and that is listed here. And we can see that the small blind's overall EV in this game is negative 724 millichips. 1,000 millichips is a chip, and it is a 1-2 blinds, $2, $4 simulation game. So the small blind loses approximately 72% of a dollar, so what's that, 36% of a big blind. And then if we look at the sim on the right here, we see the small blind's EV is negative 731 millichips. So very, very similar, right? 36.5 big blinds per 100, 36.2 big blinds per 100. Now, when I first started using MonkerSolver, I used to get bogged down in these little details and think, well, gee, if this one is worse by 7 millichips, then clearly I want to do the other. But that is not a particularly productive way to think about solver poker. 7 millichips is nothing. There are so many more areas to your game where you're going to lose a ton of EV making mistakes that would be better to focus on. So we're going to basically call these two simulations the same in terms of the small blind's EV. So this tells me that you could play a cold calling strategy in the small blind, or you could play a 3-better fold strategy in the small blind. Let's look at what actually is different though. Notice in this one here, which is a 3-better fold sim from the small blind is 3-betting 31.2% of the time, folding approximately 69%, right? Here, the small blind is only folding 66% of the time. He's mixing in 7% cold calls and the rest 3-bets. So, what we can definitively say about allowing the small blind to cold call is that if you play with cold calls, you could play a little bit more loose, right? And if I pull up the actual ranges, which I have prepared for these side by side, we can take a look at, on the left you have the 3-betting strategy 27% with cold calls. In the middle, you have the cold calling strategy versus a button open. And on the right, we have the 3-better fold only simulation. So, feel free to pause the video, study this till your heart's content. It doesn't actually matter what the exact hands are here, but we can notice some important things. One, the small blind, the solver, MonkerSolver doesn't care about playing a capped dominated range in the small blind. It is not slow playing any actual good hands in this calling strategy. If we look at this middle chart, it's calling 7% of hands, and none of them are good, right? What is like the best hand that it's throwing in some cold calls with here? Maybe Queen Jack off, King 9 off, some weak Ace X, King 8 suited, you could argue, is one of the better hands, but literally nothing actually good, right? And this is something that's very important to understand about limit poker in a solver world. Solvers are never afraid to turn their range face up and then just play that range in going forward in the hand. And I would argue that Hold'em is the game in which solvers actually do care about this concept the most. There is more 3-betting or information hiding in Hold'em games than there is in games like Omaha 8 or better, which we'll probably get to at some point on my channel. But Hold'em, in a way, because there are so few hand combinations, still actually does care a little bit about some deception value. You can see that by the solver throwing in some 3-bets with hands like 5-4 suited. This is more for like board coverage and to have some bluffs on certain board textures, right? There's other games, like I said, 08 comes to mind, where the solver's playing much more straightforwardly than that and doesn't really care at all about not having certain types of hands in its range and just playing face up. But I think that this is just something to really think about in terms of your own play. The solver kind of plays the small blind like an old school fish would, if you want my opinion, which is that like it just takes a hand that's not particularly strong and says, well, I'm getting an okay price because I've already got a small blind invested. This hand has some equity. I don't really want to fold, so I'll go ahead and cold call. And it never balances that with anything good, and it never worries about these hands all being particularly weak. So you can see here, you can choose this strategy, you can avoid this strategy. When two strategies are equal, a lot of times people tend to focus on the simpler strategy because it's easier to implement. But there might be some other reasons to consider some other strategies. So I wanted to point out one other area while we're looking at MonkerSolver here that could be a good way to think about how to decide whether you want to play a cold calling strategy in the small line or not. Let's look at the 3-better only sim, fold only sim. In this one, when we 3-bet, we're going to take a look at how the big blind is supposed to respond. The big blind is mostly not calling. He's mostly capping or folding. This is something you'll see in Solverland very often because the small blind is playing, or the big blind here is playing a tight enough range that he is doing very well against the button's opening range. In effect, the two remaining players in the hand are somewhat implicitly colluding against the weakest range that's in the hand, which is the button's like approximately 44% opening range here. If you're in a live poker game or a real limit hold'em game, ask yourself, is your opponent correctly finding these 4-bets in the big blind? Look at these weaker 4-bets that are being found by the solver here. Are you in a game where your opponent is 4-betting queen 6 suited? Are you in a game where the big blind is cold 4-betting 3s, jack 8 suited, ace 8 off? If your opponents are simply folding all of these hands or cold calling some and folding some others, then that would give a lot of merits to a 3-bet only strategy, right? Because your opponent is giving you, as well as the button, EV by making mistakes relative to what the solver thinks is the right way to play the big blind in this situation. On the other hand, you could make an argument in the other direction by saying, let's say we do cold call. Well, how's the solver supposed to respond here? How does Monker think we're supposed to respond here? It's going to 3-bet a lot more hands for value. It's going to 3-bet 19%. It's also calling a lot of hands. Obviously, folding the weakest hands, and particularly hands that play poorly multi-way. But if you cold call, is the big blind that you're playing with correctly finding these 3-bets with hands as weak as ace 4 suited, 5s, some queen jack off, king 8 suited, almost a pure 3-bet? I mean, this is also an area where I don't necessarily think human opponents are typically finding these plays. If anything, they're probably just calling all these hands, right? So that's where you really have to just ask yourself an important question, which is, however I play the small blind, what is the bigger mistake that the player on my left is most likely to make? Is he going to overfold? Is he going to fail to correctly 4-bet hands? Is he going to incorrectly forget to 3-bet me for value with these thin combinations? A lot of your play in limit poker should be dictated by what you believe is going to happen by the players that remain behind you, right? And I think that is something that you can see very clearly here when you're thinking about comparing these two strategies, which on their face are approximately equal in value. So that is just an introduction to the idea of cold calling in the small blind, some things that I think about when I'm at the table in terms of how I want to structure my strategy and what I want to try to induce from my opponents, what mistakes I think they're most likely to make. This may depend on the stakes that you're playing, the particular players that you're playing with, or any number of factors. But small blind cold calls, small blind folds, or not 3-bet and fold only strategy, both of these things are totally fine, and it really just comes down to, do you want to try to play a little looser? Do you want to try to put your opponents in a position where they're not necessarily comfortable? One final reason that cold calling small blind might be a nice strategy is keep in mind that your opponents often don't understand the reasons for your play. They might simply see you cold calling the small blind and then mimic you, but choosing hands that are way too weak to be playing at all, or just perceiving you as a weaker player than you are because they're seeing you cold call in the small blind, and their logic is only fish cold call. So, you know, there may be some metagame effects to building an image in that way as well. Just some food for thought. Let me know what questions you have. This is obviously a complicated topic, and I just decided to try to do an introduction today in MonkerSolver, give you guys a little bit of an orientation to how the solver approaches this situation and the pros and cons of each. Thanks very much, and I will see you in the comments. See you guys.